everybody, I'm Dr. Erica Sigurdsson, and welcome to our new channel, Making History. Join us as we embark on a journey to uncover untold stories, examine the way history is created, consumed, and occasionally misrepresented, and delve into the reasons why this matters more than ever in the 21st century. Today, I want us to start with a spot the difference. What difference do you see between the following two images? How about these ones? And these? I've actually got a whole Pinterest board full of these if you want to see more, but for now I'm assuming you've largely got the point. Contemporary, as in 21st century, depictions of the Middle Ages overwhelmingly use this dark, washed out, low contrast, muted color palette to depict the Middle Ages. Medieval artists, on the other hand, were relatively consistent in their preference for very bright colors. Primary colors, vibrant colors, color on color, the bigger, the better. So that leads us to two questions really, doesn't it? First, why do films about the Middle Ages look like they've never seen a color? And why do images of the Middle Ages created in the Middle Ages look like they've never seen a color they didn't like? Well, if you'll allow me, in today's video, I'm going to mostly focus on the second of these questions. I will talk a bit about modern cinematic depictions of the Middle Ages and why they're so dark and dingy looking. But I actually want to save the deeper dive on that one for a later video where I'll really get into contemporary representations of the Middle Ages and why that matters. So subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be informed of future videos. But for today, I want us to focus more of our attention on color in the Middle Ages. We need to kind of retrain our eyes a little bit to see the Middle Ages not through the lens of modernity, but on their own terms. So how did we go from medieval color explosions to our current depictions of the Middle Ages, where even wealthy knights wear these muted colors and the general aesthetic is dark, moody, and grim? Well, in my view, there are three things going on. There are material reasons, ideological and aesthetic reasons, and finally, the intersection of the two, where we see ideology or aesthetics acting on the material. So starting with material reasons, color fades. Color, it turns out, is the result of this incredibly complex chemical process, and it continues to react to its environment and in a lot of cases break down and fade and eventually disappear completely. So the illuminations I was showing you that still have these incredibly vivid colors hundreds of years later, they're the exception in medieval art, at least when it comes to survival. They were designed to last, so the paint for them was chosen from more long-lasting materials, like minerals. These are also examples of illuminations that come from manuscripts which were bound into books, meaning that they were kept away from light and other things that kill color when the book was closed. And even so, a lot of the more vivid, incredible illustrations are from the later Middle Ages, meaning that they're only 500 years old instead of 1500. Color fades. Other places where in the Middle Ages you would have seen paint or dye are not so well protected. One obvious example is fabric, both clothing and decorative furnishings, like tapestries. Textiles don't tend to survive all that well in the first place. They decompose. And the fragments that archaeologists do find do not hold their color. They look like this gross brown mush, honestly. The only reason we know that they were dyed is from a comparatively new process where chemistry people can analyze the broken down chemical components to say what dyes were used. This mucky brown fragment was bright red and dyed with a very expensive imported red dye called kermes, which comes from grinding up some kind of bug. But this creates a problem for museums or curators who want to share the reality of medieval clothing with the public. Displaying this ugly brown bit of mush doesn't really help anyone to picture what medieval clothing might have looked like, even though it's real, it's authentic. This textile fragment actually is part of a very cool reconstruction process called fashioning the Viking Age. The idea was to create modern reconstructions of Viking Age garments based on specific archaeological grave findings. This means that every aspect of the garments, including the colors, were based on data from two specific Viking Age graves, one male and one female. And this is what they came up with. Of course, these aren't necessarily exact replicas of what these two people were definitely wearing when they were buried in their graves. The archaeological evidence isn't that good. But every color used in these garments came from chemical dye analysis of the grave textiles and was created using historic dyes and dyeing methods. Were you expecting Vikings to wear yellow pants? Or were you maybe picturing them like this? Another place where color, man-made color, does not survive well is on buildings and statues. See this building? This is Wells Cathedral. It was built starting in 1175, but it did not look like this in the Middle Ages. Now it may have looked like this Now, to be clear, this is an artistic recreation. We don't know exactly what it would have looked like when it was painted, but we do know that it was painted. This recreation is based on remnants of paint that are still there on the west front of the cathedral. We also have the accounts of the 19th century dean of the cathedral who made it his project to restore the cathedral. Now, this was a man with a very excellent name of Dean Edward Goodenough. In his descriptions of the restoration, he talked about the huge amounts of whitewash and yellow ochre that they removed from both the inside and outside of the cathedral. So he called this restoration the Great Scrape. And well, there's a reason why medieval art and building historians don't love the Victorians. To be clear, Wells Cathedral is not an outlier in terms of color. It's now believed that most, if not all, medieval cathedrals and churches would have been painted very brightly inside and out. Statues that nowadays are mostly scrubbed white marble or plain stone were painted. Again, likely in a way that, to our modern eye, looks frankly pretty gaudy, garish even. One reason why we struggle to visualize the Middle Ages in all this gaudy color is that in the Western world, we have moved very sharply away from an aesthetic of bright, overwhelming color. Particularly, we've kind of flipped our associations with bright, saturated colors. In the Middle Ages, bright, deeply saturated colors were a signifier of wealth and status. Deeply saturated dyes in textiles were a sign of high quality. So some dyers, for instance, might reuse a dye batch, meaning you dye your first batch of cloth and it's dyed to the shade you want it, but any dye is left over in the vat, that could be used to put a more muted color on a second batch of cloth. But this was a sign of cheaper, lower quality work. Nowadays though, at least in Western culture, it is neutrals and muted tones that tend to be associated with wealth and class. Think of anything that could be described as a timeless classic. It's probably beige, right? Or white. We see it in fashion, we see it in home decor. And it's the wealthiest people, seemingly, who have the whitest homes. Think of that Kim Kardashian home tour. Do you remember that? Or Gwyneth Paltrow's outfits from her recent court case. And this has had an effect on how we view the past. In some ways, this is even more radical in the case of the ancient world. We know now that a lot of those artifacts of ancient Greek and Roman buildings and statues were in their time also brightly painted. It was in the neoclassical period, so the 17th and 18th centuries, when it became popular to display ancient Greek or Roman statues without paint in that pure white marble that we know today. Architecture was just loving the simple lines and plain sort of purity of unpainted white marble. And in cases where there was still paint on those ancient statues or buildings, neoclassical art enthusiasts would scrub it off, just like Dean Goodenough in Wells, not knowing or not caring that this plain white marble look was just the effect of time and wear on the paint. They recreated it and actually wound up tearing down or abandoning a lot of the medieval buildings in Britain. Wells Cathedral was genuinely a ruin when Dean Goodenough got at it, because throughout this whole neoclassical period, they preferred to build new, white, marble-fronted buildings than to maintain medieval cathedrals. So then, when the Victorians decided they really loved medieval art and architecture and wanted to restore it, well, they had still already absorbed a lot of these neoclassical aesthetics that valued bare stone, whites and neutrals, and no colors. And I want to be clear, because I worry that I'm starting to sound a little mean and unfair about neoclassical or Victorian aesthetics. Of course, from a historian's point of view, it hurts a little bit to hear about paint remnants and evidence that we could have known about if the Victorians hadn't scrubbed it off in pursuit of this more natural aesthetic. But also, tastes are allowed to change, right? Like honestly, if I lived in Tunbridge Wells, would I want to look at this smack dab in the city center? Cathedrals are historic artifacts, absolutely, but they are also living, working buildings. People today worship here and work here, and their preferences matter too. Anyway, this is a whole complex set of issues for the people who do historical preservation and interpreting to think about and work through. Now, one solution that I've seen that several places have started doing is to use projections of the possible painting onto the artifacts so visitors can see what it might have looked like without painting directly onto a 1,000-year-old artifact, which you can understand why conservators might be squeamish about. And it raises a lot of really fundamental questions about the purpose of museums and historical sites and the dance they have to do between fulfilling the public's expectations of what the past should look like and challenging it. People just don't expect a historic medieval building to look like the setting of a clown convention. We don't expect to see Vikings wearing bright yellow pants. We're finally circling back to our initial question. Why do films about the Middle Ages look so dark? First, I want to clarify what I'm talking about when I say dark, because it does encompass a couple of different aesthetic choices all kind of coming together to make dark. Firstly, there's a very specific medieval filter that films often use to indicate Middle Ages. It can be blue, like this, or a washed out look, like this. Secondly, medieval films often use a very dark color palette in their costuming. I've already shown you that full cast shot from Vikings, where they're all in black leather. Ironically, black was one color that almost never appears in medieval fashion until right at the very end of the Middle Ages. So I can think of a couple reasons for this dark aesthetic, which relate more to the art of making movies in the modern world. Firstly, I've been very interested in the ongoing discussion around overly dark movies, as in quite literally darkly lit, in recent years. The Take did a good piece on this phenomenon, which seems to be coming from a combination of technological changes and aesthetic choices. For our purposes, it means that dark is a pretty common aesthetic choice, even well outside of medieval movies. Secondly, the vast majority of films about the Middle Ages are also violent, kind of action-adventure or war genre films. So this dark, gritty, realist aesthetic that you find in medieval films reflects the aesthetic trends of this genre, which are dark, gritty, and realist. There's one other factor that I think is worth mentioning. Namely, if you look at medieval movies from the golden age of Hollywood cinema, so 1940s and 50s, you will notice that the big medieval epics that they were making in those days were in fact extremely colorful and larger than life. In their color palettes, if not in other ways, they more accurately reflect the medieval aesthetic. So it's possible that these grimly colorless modern interpretations of the Middle Ages are a reaction to that older aesthetic. So far, what I've mostly been talking about are factors relating to filmmaking and Hollywood trends, but I don't actually believe that those are the only or even the most important factors that go into the distinctively dark medieval aesthetic of modern movies. Instead, I would argue that the dark lighting, dark filters, and dark costuming choices that dominate movies about the Middle Ages serve as visual metaphors for the Middle Ages as Dark Ages. The truth is that we have very strong preconceptions about the Middle Ages, which Hollywood media tends to absorb and reflect. These ideas tend to be negative and tend to position the Middle Ages as a dark mirror to our own culture, either as an embodiment of the opposite of all our supposed good qualities or as an extreme exaggeration of all our perceived bad qualities. This is a prejudice that has proven very hard to shake, and for reasons that I will absolutely be delving into in more detail in future videos. But for now, I just want us to notice the elements that lend themselves to creating this dark aesthetic. We have this idea that the Middle Ages were uniquely brutal and violent, that they were a time of constant warfare, gruesome tortures, executions, persecutions, the whole of that. We also have this idea of the Middle Ages as technologically and culturally stagnant, or being a time of gross inequality and brutal economic conditions. But finally, and to my mind maybe the most damaging, I find that the popular view of the Middle Ages is one of such unrelenting, dour seriousness. This, to be honest, is one of the reasons I so rarely watch movies about the Middle Ages, even more so than the violence and gore, which I also don't like. But they're just so serious. And the dark costuming and dark filters just play into this somber, dour seriousness. And it doesn't have to be like that. Like, look at this bedding. Or this one. Like, look at them. Just look at these people. Look at them. Just two regular people making out in their very normal, floor-to-ceiling, red drapery, bedecked bed while their little poodle tries awkwardly not to make eye contact. They're great! They're living their best life. That vision of the Middle Ages is beautiful. It's weird and wonderful. It's often very funny. Sure, it's still often violent and brutal, it's pretty sexist, and it's extremely hierarchical. But it's way more interesting, way more alive than the one-note, colorless imaginings of mainstream culture. It is deeply understandable that our current vision of the Middle Ages is so dark and so devoid of color. Color fades. Even experts and historians who know, intellectually, that buildings were brightly colored and medieval fashion was full on, can have a hard time picturing it when what is left to us is bare stone and ruins. We have to work to reimagine the Middle Ages as they actually were, not how they've been left to us. That is already hard, but it's made so much harder by the resistance of the popular imagination. I focused here on films, but we could talk about so many other places where the Middle Ages are imagined. Video games, fantasy novels, Pinterest, Nightcore vibes. We want so hard for the Middle Ages to look the way that we expect to see them, the way we've seen them depicted over and over and over again. I think that's part of the reason why I personally keep coming back to the Middle Ages, why I love medieval history. It'll surprise you, and it'll force you to rethink those boring old ideas, the stale image of a dark, gloomy, backwards time. I'm excited to keep exploring these ideas with you. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Goodbye everyone and take care. See, it doesn't have a good ending, does it? But I'm done.